Considering we've been through a federal election here in Australia in the last 4 or 5 months, and now a state election in Victoria, and there's a state election coming up in New South Wales in March, I thought I'd explore what democracy is. I mean, the classical definition is rule of the people, by the people, for the people. Like the word freedom, the word democracy has many connotations, but you can divide it into two major types. Like you've got freedom from and freedom to. Freedom to exploit, freedom from exploitation. It's the same with democracy. You have two definitions. You have what we have in Australia, and which was pioneered to a significant degree in this country, representative democracy, and you've got direct democracy. Now, you can have a democratic society and have gross inequalities in that society, because democracy doesn't really address the issue of inequality. It doesn't address the issue of resources and how they're distributed and how they're used. Because, see, in a democratic society, you need access to both power and wealth in order to enjoy the fruits of that society. You can have all the power you have, even a direct democratic society, and I'll explain what that is. But that doesn't mean that you'll be able to enjoy the bounty of that land because of inequalities in wealth. And we see this constantly in Australia and other so-called democratic societies in the West, where access to wealth has very little to do with the democratic process. And although they are nominal democracies, the fact is that a representative democracy and even a direct democracy that is not based on access to wealth really has very little to do with democracy. Let's go back to the original definition. Democracy, rule of the people, by the people. Let's look at the various forms of democracy. And a good way to start this, as we've just celebrated the 168th anniversary of the Eureka Rebellion, is to actually look at what the demands were and how the Eureka rebels actually organised. Now, a lot of people who are in trade unions and other organisations understand the concept of delegation. Direct democracy is based on the concept of delegates. Delegates who are given specific mandates to negotiate and then come back to have those decisions ratified by the group that actually gave them the mandate. That's direct democracy. Representative democracy is what we have here in Australia and most of the Western world, or all of the Western world. And that is that you elect somebody for 3 to 4 years to make decisions for you. And it's not a matter of independence with different ideas, putting forward ideas which you then decide on. Representative democracy is dominated by political forces and political parties. And to a certain extent, the way those political parties works is based on legislation which goes through the parliamentary system, which assists those political parties to retain power. And that's what we see at every election. You see same title organisations be elected and re-elected, not because of a gerrymander, not because of unequal electorates, but because of the lack of resources to conduct political campaigns, the lack of people, and the fact that the government-owned media and the corporate-owned media decide who are the candidates that are worthy of promoting and what are the policies that are worthy of promoting. So you wonder why in a country of 26 million people living on a continent, a resource-rich continent, we still have private charities asking you to give them money so we can send kids to public schools, which are theoretically financed by the state. And you wonder how we've got ourselves in this ridiculous situation. You wonder when people talk about escalating energy prices and escalating gas prices, the fact that we're the second biggest exporter of gas in the world, but we can't actually allocate gas for local consumption and production, really highlights the weaknesses of representative democracy. Because you can elect a political party or representative, they can make all the promises in the world, but they don't have to do anything regarding honouring those promises the next 3 to 4 years, unless direct pressure is put on them by a dissatisfied public. And then in 3 or 4 years' time, you go through the same charade. That's what representative democracy all is about. Now, that wouldn't be half bad. But the dilemma is, in a Western democratic society where there is inequalities in wealth, as well as inequalities in power, but especially inequalities in wealth, you find it's those organisations, those corporations, those individuals who have acquired wealth by hook or by crook, who are then able to determine the parliamentary agenda. And that's why we seem to be facing the same problems over and over and over again and find no solutions to those problems. Or we keep harping on peripheral issues which really make little difference to the great majority of people. So I think elections highlight weaknesses, gross weaknesses in our society. They pinpoint the very issues that need to be addressed in order to have a rule of the people, by the people, for the people. Because it doesn't matter how many representatives a particular party has in Parliament. Look at the West Australian Parliament, which has, I think, 97% of the seats in the lower house controlled by the Australian Labor Party. But again, they seem to have all the same issues regarding Aboriginal exploitation, regarding land rights, regarding access to resources, as everybody else, although there's not much of an opposition. You would think that they would be in a position to actually resolve these issues through parliamentary action, through the passage of laws which address these issues. And that's the dilemma when you have a democracy which is not based on the common ownership of the nation's resources for the good of the citizens and residents of that nation, not the good of unelected and unaccountable corporations who are so large to actually determine the parliamentary agenda. And that's the key. Who determines the parliamentary agenda? Do you determine the parliamentary agenda? Do I determine the parliamentary agenda? Now, we're rich enough in this country to have a universal basic income, which will resolve many of the issues which we face as a society. But there's never any debate about a universal basic income, because that would mean a radical realignment in the way taxes are raised, and a radical realignment in the power which is able to be wielded by people who control wealth. And most of that wealth is based on proactive legislation which suits them. It's based on the fact that legislation which actually looks at their power and wealth never seems to appear in Parliament. If it does, there are huge campaigns conducted by these organisations to ensure that legislation doesn't even see the light of day. And then you have the ridiculous situation every day. We have 120,000 registered charities in this country, shaking a tin for a few coins in order to address issues which we as a society should be able to issue through Parliament. So if we had a democratic society, you would think that we would be able to address these issues. And if you look at the issues that I'm looking at now, and now that I'm in my early 70s, compared to the issues that I looked at when I was a teenager, they're breathtakingly similar. Access to health, access to education, access to wealth, using the country's resources, and the list goes on and on. Obviously there's been some issue-orientated legislation which has gone through Parliament after a lot of debate and division. But as far as the central elements of inequalities in power and wealth are concerned, we see no change. And unfortunately in this country, because of our constitutional arrangements, it's only a political party which controls both houses of Parliament which is actually able to put a question to the people in a referendum so they can actually make a decision. And those people who think that the Labor Premier in Victoria, Mr Andrews, is talking about the creation of a publicly owned renewable energy system and incorporating its ownership in the Victorian Constitution, think again. In Victoria, it's not the electors which decide what's in the Constitution. In Victoria, unlike in Australia as a country, it's not the electors, it's the government of the day. So there is no protection in placing that type of asset in the Victorian Constitution, because the government of the majority in both houses of Parliament can actually sell that public asset at any time it's like, unlike the federal situation. But we don't see governments talking about holding referendums to create publicly owned renewable energy sources whose ownership is incorporated in the Constitution. We do see every few years some political debate about changing, introducing some constitutional reform. And they're few and far between. Since Federation, there has been less than 95 questions put to the Australian people. So, it leaves few options for people who want constitutional change. It leaves few options for people who want direct democracy, rule of the people, for the people, by the people. It leaves few options for those people who think that resources should be held in common and used for the common good. So while we have our financial sector, our political sector, our representative democracy dominated by a small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, we will continue to face the same problems irrespective of the government that's in power. So that leaves protest. It leaves the door open for revolutionary change, because there's no way you can actually make major changes to the Constitution in this country. And that's what makes it so difficult, because there are no mechanism in a Western democracy and in an Australian society which allows our parliamentary representatives, who we theoretically elect, to actually put legislation in place which makes fundamental changes. And we saw this when Mr Rudd, former Prime Minister, irrespective of his personal defects, where he attempted to introduce a super profit tax on the mining industry. Remember, the mining industry has carte blanche to develop resources that we own and give us back a pittance in royalties. And that's the dilemma that we face constantly. There is no change. And we've got to the situation in this country, irrespective of the new industrial relations laws, where withdrawing your labour has become a criminal offence in this country. I know we like to talk about China and all the horrible things there, but it would be nice to actually look at all the horrible things in this country, because we are a democracy and theoretically we should be able to address these issues. We can't address these issues while we continue with the same situation. So the new year is approaching rapidly. You do have options. We all have options. We can drown ourselves in social media, clicking, agreeing and changing nothing. We can wait for the next state election or the next federal election, hoping against hope that a political party with some type of political agenda which promotes the idea of direct democracy or democracy, rule of the people, by the people, for the people, we can go to sleep. We can take up some religious belief. We can take up a hobby, a sporting endeavour. But the reality is that in any society, whether it's democratic, whether it's autocratic, whether it's a dictatorship, whether it's a benevolent dictator, the fact is that ultimately the type of society we have is determined by the amount of people who are willing to look beyond their personal situation, beyond the situation of their family, beyond the situation of their language group, beyond the situation of their cultural allegiances, beyond their racial origins, beyond their sexual orientations or gender, and actually look at trying to create a society where freedom means something. Not the freedom to exploit or the freedom to walk around spreading disease, but the freedom to actually live our lives free of fear. Fear regarding the domination of the economy by the corporate sector, free of fear from a state legislation, from federal legislation, which can be quite draconian because we have no protection for our basic human rights in this country and our constitutional arrangements. Fear of penury, the everyday fear of not being able to pay your bills, the everyday fear of losing your job, the everyday fear of actually not being able to pay the mortgage or the rent. Because the difference between a successful life in a capitalist society based on a wage system where there is no universal basic income, where there is no democracy, is 6 weeks' wages. Think about it. Remember, ultimately, hope is the love child of desire and expectation, the desire for change and the expectation that change will occur. The more we are privatised as individuals, the more we withdraw from society, the more we refuse to think about what is important, drowning ourselves in alcohol or drugs or some other addiction, the less the chances of fundamental political change.